Ruby Gonzalez set her cleaning supplies down on the cold marble floor, her eyes sweeping across the $10 million penthouse. Not a sound, not a breath of life. Only Seattle's pale winter light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows over the crystal chess set positioned in the center of the living room, pieces standing motionless like soldiers frozen in a battle no one remembered fighting. From the distant hallway she heard the whisper of small footsteps. Two children appeared at the top of the spiral staircase, eyes wide as they stared at her like she was some alien creature. 6 years old, pale as porcelain, matching blonde hair cut with surgical precision. Twins. Ruby smiled and waved. They said nothing, just stood there like two small statues. "Hello," Ruby whispered. "Want to see me turn housework into magic?" The twins exchanged a glance, and for the first time in 2 years, one of them smiled. The smile vanished the moment James Morrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Ms. Gonzalez." His footsteps echoed across the marble as he descended the stairs, each step measured and deliberate. "I trust Mrs. Patterson explained the boundaries." Ruby straightened, clasping her hands in front of her worn jeans. James Morrison looked exactly like the photos she'd seen in Seattle Business Journal. Sharp jaw, steel gray eyes, dark hair that probably cost more to maintain than she made in a month. But the photos hadn't captured the exhaustion etched around his eyes, or the way his shoulders carried invisible weight. "Yes, sir. Clean the house, don't interact with the children." "Correct." He barely glanced at the twins, who had retreated further up the stairs like startled deer. "Ollie, Liam, Dr. Carter will be here at 3 for your session." Neither boy responded. They simply turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving behind the kind of silence that felt like held breath. Ruby watched them go, her heart clenching. In her psychology classes at the University of Washington, she'd learned about selective mutism in children. Trauma could steal voices as easily as it stole sleep. But these boys weren't just quiet. They moved like ghosts haunting their own home. "The cleaning supplies are in the utility closet," James said, already pulling out his phone. "Mrs. Patterson left detailed instructions. I'll be in my office on the top floor. The children's wing is off limits." "Mr. Morrison." "Is there a problem, Ms. Gonzalez?" Ruby met his gaze, nodding how he held himself like armor was welded to his spine. "No, sir. No problem at all." He nodded once and strode toward the elevator, leaving her alone with the echo of his expensive shoes and the crystal chess set that seemed to watch her with accusing eyes. Ruby had grown up in South Seattle, where silence meant danger and noise meant life. This penthouse felt like a museum dedicated to quiet desperation. Every surface gleamed, every angle was perfect, and not a single thing looked like it had been touched by human hands. Even the children's toys were arranged in precise rows on their designated shelves, untouched as artifacts. She started with the kitchen, pulling on her rubber gloves and humming under her breath, an old habit from helping her mother clean house after house to keep them fed. The melody was something her abuela used to sing, full of warmth and hope, and the promise that every ending was also a beginning. Through the sound system speakers, she heard movement upstairs. The boys were listening. Ruby glanced around the pristine kitchen, then made a decision that would change everything. She turned up her humming just a notch, adding a little bounce to her step as she wiped down counters that were already spotless. When she moved to the living room, she let her cloth dance across the coffee table in time with the rhythm in her head. She was polishing the crystal chess set when she noticed the camera in the corner, its red light blinking steadily. James Morrison was watching. Good. Let him watch her bring a little life into his mausoleum. Ruby picked up the White Queen, a piece so beautiful it caught the light like captured starlight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, probably worth more than her car. As she polished it, she found herself studying the intricate details, the delicate crown, the flowing robes carved into the crystal. This wasn't just a game piece. This was art. This was love made tangible. A sound from upstairs made her look up. One of the twins, Ollie, she thought, was peering through the glass railing, watching her work. When their eyes met, he ducked back out of sight. Ruby grinned and kept humming, making her movements a little more theatrical. She dusted the chess board like she was conducting an orchestra, each swipe of her cloth a musical note. When she moved to the next room, she added a little spin to her turn, letting her long, dark hair catch the light. More footsteps above. Now both boys were watching. She spent the morning turning housework into performance art, aware of her invisible audience. When she vacuumed, she danced with the machine like it was her partner at a salsa club. When she arranged flowers in the pristine vases, she hummed louder, letting the melody fill spaces that had forgotten how to hold joy. By noon, she'd cleaned half the penthouse and gathered an impressive collection of intel. The refrigerator was stocked with organic everything but looked barely touched. The children's bathroom had 2 toothbrushes and 2 cups, but everything else was doubled. 2 of every toy, 2 identical sets of clothes, 2 beds positioned so the occupants could see each other across the room. These boys lived as a unit, protecting each other from a world that had already taken too much. The photo on James's desk showed a woman with laughing eyes and honey-colored hair, her arms wrapped around the twins when they were perhaps 4 years old. Sarah Morrison, according to the inscription on the frame. Ruby could see where the boys had inherited their delicate features and pale coloring. She could also see the way James had positioned the photo, so it was the first thing he'd see every morning and the last thing before he turned off the lights. Ruby was replacing the photo when she heard it, a sound so soft she almost missed it. Laughter. One of the twins was giggling at her reflected performance in the hallway mirror. She froze, cloth still in hand, afraid to breathe and break the spell. "It's okay," she whispered to the empty room, though she knew they were listening. "Laughter is allowed here. Your mama would want you to laugh." The giggling stopped abruptly, replaced by the familiar silence, but something had shifted. The air itself felt different, charged with possibility. Ruby finished the penthouse as the Seattle afternoon light faded to gray. She was packing her supplies when she heard the elevator chime. James Morrison stepped out, his tie loosened and his phone pressed to his ear. "Don't care what the board says, Marcus. I'm not putting the company before." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw her. "I'll call you back." "All finished, Mr. Morrison." Ruby shouldered her bag, trying to read his expression. "Same time tomorrow." He walked through the living room, his gaze taking in surfaces that gleamed like mirrors and air that smelled faintly of lemon oil and hope. When he reached the chess set, he paused, his fingers hovering over the white queen she'd polished to perfection. "The boys were watching you." It wasn't a question, but Ruby nodded anyway. Children are curious, it's natural. "They haven't been curious about anything in 2 years. His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the tremor underneath. "Not since." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Sometimes," Ruby said carefully, "we forget that healing can look like playing." James's hand closed around the chess piece, his knuckles white with tension. "Ms. Gonzalez, I hired you to clean my home, not to offer therapy." "I'm not offering therapy. I'm offering honest work done with joy." She met his gaze steadily. Maybe that's what they needed to see. For a moment, something flickered in his steel-gray eyes, hope, maybe, or fear. Then the mask slammed back into place. "Same time tomorrow," he said, setting the queen back in her square with mathematical precision. Ruby was halfway to the door when she heard it, a voice so small and rusty from disuse that she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. "Stay." She turned. Liam stood at the top of the stairs, one small hand gripping the railing, his twin brother beside him like a shadow. In 2 years of silence, he'd chosen this moment, this word. "Stay." James Morrison stood frozen in his living room, his hand still resting on a crystal chess piece, watching his son speak for the first time since the world had cracked in half. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge none of them knew how to cross. Ruby's phone rang at 7:30 the next morning, jolting her from dreams of crystal chess pieces and gray eyes that held too much pain. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakable. "Ms. Gonzalez, this is James Morrison." She sat up in her narrow bed, glancing around the studio apartment she shared with textbooks and unpaid bills. Through the thin walls, she could hear her neighbor's baby crying, a sound of life that seemed impossibly distant from the marble silence of the Morrison penthouse. "Mr. Morrison, is everything okay?" A pause. "Dr. Carter believes that yesterday's incident may have been significant. She's advised that we continue with whatever environmental factors might have contributed to Liam's vocalization." Ruby translated the clinical language. "You want me to come back?" "I want you to clean my house, Ms. Gonzalez. Nothing more." But his voice carried an undertone she recognized, the desperate hope of a parent who'd been drowning for 2 years and had just felt solid ground beneath his feet. "I'll be there at 9. There will be conditions." Ruby waited, phone pressed to her ear as she watched Seattle's morning fog roll past her single window. "You may speak to the children while you work. Casual interaction only. Nothing therapeutic. Nothing that could be construed as overstepping professional boundaries." She almost laughed. Professional boundaries, as if there were a handbook for bringing dead houses back to life. "I understand. And Ms. Gonzalez, Dr. Carter will be observing today. Please remember that you are there to clean, not to perform." The line went dead. Ruby stared at the phone, then at her reflection in the black screen. Yesterday, she'd been hired help who happened to make a child laugh. Today, she was an environmental factor in a therapeutic intervention. The promotion felt more like a trap than a victory. The penthouse felt different when she arrived. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. James met her at the elevator, his expensive suit armor against whatever hope or fear he was carrying. "Dr. Carter is in the library," he said without preamble. "The boys are having breakfast." Ruby nodded, nodding how he said the boys like they were a single entity. In her psychology textbooks, she'd read about twins who developed their own language, their own world. But this felt different, less like shared creation and more like shared survival. She set up her supplies in the kitchen, hyper-aware of the cameras, the watching doctor, the man who stood by the window pretending to read emails on his phone. The weight of all that attention should have made her nervous. Instead, it made her stubborn. If they wanted to see environmental factors, she'd give them environmental factors. Ruby started humming as she wiped down the already spotless counters, the same melody from yesterday. Within minutes, she heard the soft shuffle of small feet on marble. The twins appeared in the kitchen doorway like matching bookends, their pale faces solemn but curious. "Good morning, Ollie. Good morning, Liam." She didn't stop working, didn't make a big deal of their presence. Just acknowledged them like the small humans they were, entitled to be seen and greeted. Neither responded verbally, but Ollie, the bolder of the two, took a half step into the kitchen. Ruby continued her routine, turning cleaning into choreography. When she reached for the high shelves, she stretched like a dancer. When she organized the spice rack, she hummed a little louder. The boys crept closer, drawn by the novelty of an adult who moved like joy was possible. "Your daddy has a lot of fancy spices," Ruby said conversationally, examining a bottle of saffron that cost more than her weekly grocery budget. "I bet your mama used to cook with these." The boys went very still. Ruby kept working, giving them space to process the mention of their mother, the first person, she'd guess, to speak of Sarah Morrison like she was a person instead of a tragedy. "My abuela, that's my grandma. She used to say that kitchens remember all the love that happens in them." Ruby opened a cabinet and found it stocked with organic children's cereals and gourmet ingredients that looked barely touched. This kitchen is waiting to remember. Liam moved closer, his small hand reaching out to touch the marble countertop like he was testing whether it was real. "Want to help me dust?" Ruby asked, pulling out a soft cloth. "It's more fun with a partner." The boys exchanged one of their silent conversations, a language of glances and micro-expressions that spoke volumes. Finally, Ollie nodded. Ruby tore the cloth in half, handing each boy a piece. "The secret," she said conspiratorially, "is to pretend you're erasing all the sad dust and leaving room for happy dust." "There's no such thing as happy dust," Ollie said, his voice rusty but clear. Ruby's heart did a little flip. 2 sentences in 2 days. Dr. Carter was probably taking notes about therapeutic breakthroughs and environmental interventions, but all Ruby heard was the sound of a little boy remembering how to be skeptical, which was just another way of remembering how to think. "You're absolutely right," she said solemnly. "There's no such thing as happy dust, but there is such a thing as making boring work more interesting by pretending." Liam giggled, a sound like silver bells that made Ruby's chest tight with hope. They worked together for 20 minutes, the boys mimicking her movements as she dusted surfaces that didn't need dusting. When Ruby caught sight of James in the doorway, she pretended not to notice how he was gripping the frame like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Daddy," Ollie said without turning around, "Ruby says kitchens have memory." James's sharp intake of breath was audible from across the room. His son had not only spoken to Ruby but had spoken about her to him. In the linguistics of healing, this was a quantum leap. "Does she?" James's voice was carefully controlled. "Mama used to make pancakes," Liam whispered, so quietly Ruby almost missed it. "On Sundays." The silence that followed was different from the dead quiet Ruby had encountered yesterday. This silence was full, pregnant with memory and possibility, and the dangerous hope that maybe things could be different. James cleared his throat. "Dr. Carter would like to observe your methods more closely." Ruby nodded, though something prickled at the back of her neck. She was being studied like a specimen, her every interaction catalogued and analyzed. The boys were responding to her, yes, but were they responding to her humanity or to her utility as a therapeutic tool? Dr. Helen Carter appeared in the kitchen doorway, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a clipboard that never left her hands. "Ms. Gonzalez, I'm impressed by the boys' engagement level. Have you worked with selective mutism before?" "I've worked with shy kids," Ruby said carefully, "and I've worked with kids who have lost people they love." "Your approach is unconventional." Ruby kept dusting, aware that Ollie and Liam were listening to every word. "I don't have an approach, I just treat them like people." Nevertheless, the results speak for themselves. Dr. Carter made a note on her clipboard. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of expanding your role here, perhaps structured activities that could." "No." Everyone turned to look at James, who had gone very pale. "They're not lab rats," he said quietly, "and she's not a therapist." Ruby felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that James Morrison might be controlling and distant, but he was also protective of his sons in ways that mattered. "Of course not," Dr. Carter said smoothly. "I simply meant that we could formalize some of the interactions that are already proving beneficial." "The interactions are beneficial because they're natural," Ruby heard herself saying. "The minute you make them homework, they stop being real." Dr. Carter's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You seem to have strong opinions about child psychology for someone whose background is in housekeeping." The words were polite, but the dismissal underneath was clear. Ruby felt her cheeks flush, aware suddenly of her second-hand clothes and her calloused hands, and the way she probably smelled like discount detergent instead of expensive perfume. "Ruby knows about kids," Ollie said fiercely, stepping closer to her like a small guardian. She's nice to us. The simple declaration hit the room like a thunderbolt. In a world of therapeutic interventions and environmental factors and professional boundaries, a 6-year-old had cut straight to the heart of the matter. Ruby was nice to them. She treated them like they mattered. James was staring at his son like he was seeing him for the first time in years. "Ollie," he said softly, "Daddy, can Ruby teach us to clean things, like a game?" The question hung in the air between father and son, loaded with significance Ruby was only beginning to understand. James looked at her, and for a moment his careful mask slipped. She saw the man underneath, exhausted, grieving, desperate to connect with his children but terrified of doing it wrong. "What kind of game?" he asked. Ruby glanced between the boys and their father, aware that she was standing at a crossroads. She could play it safe, stick to her role as the helpful cleaning lady who happened to make the children smile, or she could take a risk that might change everything. "We could teach you too," she said quietly, "if you wanted to learn." The offer hung between them, fragile as crystal. James stared at her like she'd suggested something revolutionary, which Ruby realized she had. When was the last time anyone had offered to teach James Morrison anything? When was the last time he'd been invited to play? "I don't play games," he said finally. "Neither did we," Liam whispered, "before Ruby." Ruby watched something crack behind James's eyes, some wall he'd built to keep the pain contained. His sons were coming back to life, and he was still locked in the tomb of his grief, watching from behind glass. "Maybe," she said gently, "that's exactly why you should." James looked at his boys, who were watching him with hope written across their small faces, then at Ruby, who was holding her breath in a dust rag, and the fragile possibility that healing could happen in the most ordinary moments. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "What would I have to do?" Ruby smiled, and for the first time since she'd entered the penthouse, the crystal chess set caught the light like it was winking. Ruby arrived the next morning to find James Morrison sitting at his kitchen island, staring at a cup of coffee like it held the answers to questions he was afraid to ask. He traded his usual armor of expensive suits for dark jeans and a gray sweater that made his eyes look more blue than steel. The casual clothes should have made him seem more approachable, but instead, they highlighted how uncomfortable he was in his own skin outside the boardroom. "Good morning," she said, setting down her supplies. He looked up and she caught something vulnerable in his expression before he could hide it. "The boys are still sleeping. I thought, if you're going to teach us this cleaning game, I should understand the rules first." Ruby poured herself a cup of coffee from the machine that probably cost more than her monthly rent, nodding how he'd automatically prepared enough for two. Small gestures of consideration seemed to come naturally to him, even when he was trying to maintain distance. "There are no rules," she said, settling onto the stool across from him. "That's the point. There are always rules." James's fingers drummed against the marble countertop, a nervous tick that humanized him more than any casual clothes could. "I don't do anything without understanding the parameters." Ruby studied his face, nodding the circles under his eyes and the way he held his shoulders like he was bracing for impact. "When's the last time you played with your boys?" The question hit its mark. James went very still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "I mean really played," Ruby continued gently. "Not educational activities or structured enrichment, just played." "I don't remember." The admission came out rough like it had been scraped from somewhere deep. "Before Sarah died, she was the one who, I was always working, building the company, traveling, making sure we had everything we needed." He set down his cup with shaking hands. "I thought providing was the same as loving." Ruby felt her chest tighten with recognition. Her own father had left when providing got too hard, when love felt like a burden instead of a gift. But James hadn't left. He'd just forgotten how to be present while staying in the same room. Maybe, she said carefully, you were loving them the only way you knew how. Sarah used to say that. James's voice was barely audible. She'd tell me the boys needed me, not just what I could give them. But I was building something for them, a legacy, security. I thought I had time to figure out the rest. The kitchen fell quiet except for the distant hum of Seattle traffic 40 floors below. Ruby wanted to reach across the marble island and take his hand, to offer the kind of comfort her mother used to give with warm palms and whispered promises that everything would be okay. But she was the cleaning lady, and he was the CEO, and some distances couldn't be crossed with good intentions alone. "What did Sarah teach you?" she asked instead. For the first time since she'd known him, James smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Chess. She said it was the perfect metaphor for marriage. You have to protect your king, but you can't win if you don't move your pieces forward. Ruby's breath caught. The crystal set in the living room. Wedding gift from her father. Sarah and I used to play every night after the boys went to bed. She was better than me, more intuitive. I'd plan 5 moves ahead and she'd see something I'd completely missed. His expression grew distant. After she died, I couldn't. The board reminded me too much of her laughter when she'd checkmate me. But you kept it. I kept everything. James rubbed his temples like he was fighting a headache. The boys' rooms look exactly like they did when Sarah was alive. Her clothes are still in our closet. I thought if I preserved everything perfectly, maybe the pain would make sense. Maybe they'd remember her better if nothing changed. Ruby thought about the museum-quiet penthouse, the untouched toys, the way Ollie and Liam moved through their home like visitors in someone else's life. James hadn't been preserving memories. He'd been preserving a mausoleum. "What if," she said slowly, "instead of keeping everything the same, you let them remember her by living?" Before James could respond, the soft patter of feet announced the arrival of 2 small boys in matching pajamas. Ollie and Liam appeared in the kitchen doorway, their hair sticking up in identical cowlicks, eyes still heavy with sleep. "Daddy," Liam's voice was small and uncertain, "are you sad again?" The question hit James like a physical blow. Ruby watched him struggle between his instinct to protect them from his pain and his desperate need to connect. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but not right now." Ollie climbed onto the stool beside his father, studying James's face with 6-year-old intensity. "Ruby makes the sad smaller." "Does she?" James looked at Ruby with something that might have been gratitude or might have been fear. "How?" "She sings when she works," Liam said, scrambling up beside his brother. "And she makes everything shiny, and she talks about Mama like she was real." Ruby's throat tightened. In the boys' world, their mother had become a ghost, mentioned in whispers by adults who were afraid that speaking her name would cause more damage. No wonder they'd stopped talking. Who wants to use their voice when every word feels dangerous? "Your mama was very real," Ruby said softly. "And she must have been amazing if she raised 2 boys brave enough to help a stranger clean house." "She made the best pancakes," Ollie said solemnly, "with faces." "And she read voices for all the characters," Liam added. "Different ones for the dragon and the princess and the knight." James was staring at his sons like they were speaking a foreign language. Ruby realized these might be the most words they'd spoken about their mother since she died. "She sounds like she was fun," Ruby said. "She was the most fun," Ollie declared. "Daddy's not fun anymore." The brutally honest assessment hung in the air like a challenge. James flinched, but he didn't deflect or make excuses. He just sat there, taking in the truth of his son's words. "You're right," he said quietly. "I forgot how to be fun. Maybe Ruby could teach all of us." Ruby felt the weight of their expectations settle on her shoulders like a mantle she wasn't sure she deserved to wear. This wasn't about cleaning anymore. This was about a family learning how to be alive together again. "Okay," she said, standing up with decision. "First lesson, everything is more interesting if you pretend it's something else." She led them to the living room, where the crystal chess set caught the morning light like captured fire. The boys hung back, conditioned to treat the beautiful pieces like museum artifacts, but Ruby walked right up to the board. "This isn't just a chess set," she announced. "This is a kingdom, and every kingdom needs stories." She picked up the White Queen, the piece she'd polished so carefully on her first day, and held it up to catch the light. "This is Queen Sarah," she said, and felt James go very still behind her. She was brave and smart, and she loved her kingdom more than anything in the world. Liam crept closer, drawn by the story. "What about the king?" Ruby picked up the White King, smaller and somehow more fragile-looking than his queen. "This is King James. He's very good at protecting his kingdom, but he's been so busy being strong that he forgot how to play." "And these," Ollie pointed to the two knights, their crystal horses frozen mid-leap. "These are the twin princes, Ollie and Liam. They're the most important pieces on the whole board because they're the future of the kingdom." James moved to stand beside her, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah used to tell them stories like this. She'd make up adventures for all the pieces." Ruby carefully placed the queen back in her square, then turned to face the family she was somehow, impossibly, being trusted to help heal. "Want to learn how to play, the real way, I mean, not just stories." James hesitated, his eyes on the crystal pieces that held so much history and pain. "I don't know if I remember the rules." "It's like riding a bike," Ruby said gently. "Some things your hands remember even when your heart forgets." What happened next was something Ruby would remember for the rest of her life. James Morrison, CEO, millionaire, man who controlled boardrooms and commanded respect from senators, sat down on his marble floor like a child and began teaching his sons and their cleaning lady how to play chess. His hands shook as he picked up the first piece, but his voice grew steadier with each rule he explained. The boys leaned against him, their small bodies relaxing into his warmth as he showed them how knights moved in L-shapes and bishops traveled diagonally across their crystal battlefield. "The queen is the most powerful piece," he told them, cradling Sarah's crystal counterpart in his palm. "She can move anywhere she wants, but even the queen can't win the game alone." "What wins?" Liam asked. James looked at Ruby, then at his sons, then at the chess board where all their pieces waited in perfect formation. "Working together," he said, "taking care of each other, that's how you win." They played for 2 hours, the boys making illegal moves and giggling when Ruby dramatically protested their creative interpretations of the rules. James laughed, actually laughed, when Ollie tried to make his knight jump over 3 pawns, because horses can jump over fences, Daddy. Ruby was teaching Liam how to properly move his bishop when her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and felt her stomach drop. "Management position open at Sunrise Cleaning Services. Full-time, benefits $18 hour. Interview today at 3 p.m. if interested. Mrs. Patterson." It was everything she needed: steady work, decent pay, a chance to focus on finishing her degree without worrying about rent. It was also goodbye to this strange, wonderful, complicated situation that had somehow become the best part of her days. "Everything okay?" James asked, noticing her expression. Ruby slipped her phone back into her pocket, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine, just scheduling stuff." But as she watched Liam carefully move his crystal pawn forward 1 square, as she saw Ollie lean against his father's shoulder while studying the board, as she caught James looking at her with something that might have been trust or might have been something deeper, Ruby realized that everything was decidedly not fine. She was falling in love with this family, and she had no idea what she was going to do about it. The thought terrified her more than any chess strategy ever could, because unlike the crystal pieces on their board, real people couldn't be moved at will or protected from capture. Real people could be lost, and Ruby had learned long ago that the safest way to play was never to risk your heart on a game you might not win. But as James reached over to help Liam with his next move, their hands brushing over the Crystal Queen, Ruby wondered if maybe, just maybe, some games were worth the risk of losing everything. The crisis came 3 days later, arriving in the form of Marcus Webb and a leather briefcase full of solutions Ruby hadn't known they needed. She was teaching the boys how to dust the baseboards, a task that had devolved into a game where they pretended to be knights cleaning dragon lairs, when the elevator chimed with the particular authority that meant business had come calling. James appeared from his office, straightening his tie like armor, his relaxed demeanor from their chess lessons evaporating in seconds. "Marcus," he said, and Ruby heard 2 years of complicated history in that single word. "I wasn't expecting you." Marcus Webb looked exactly like what Ruby imagined when someone said corporate shark. Silver hair, expensive suit, smile that never reached his calculating eyes. He swept into the penthouse like he owned it, which, Ruby realized with growing unease, he might partially do. "James," his voice carried the particular warmth of old friendships tested by tragedy. "We need to talk." Ruby caught the boys' hands, pulling them gently away from their cleaning game. Something in the air had shifted, the easy comfort they'd built over the past week fracturing like thin ice. "Boys, why don't you go wash your hands?" she suggested quietly. "But we're not done with the dragon lair," Ollie protested. "The dragons will wait," Ruby assured him, though she had a sinking feeling that whatever was about to happen would change everything. James watched his sons disappear toward their bathroom, then turned to Marcus with the careful neutrality of a man preparing for battle. "What's this about?" Marcus set his briefcase on the kitchen island with deliberate precision. "The board is concerned, James, about your focus, about your priorities." His gaze flickered to Ruby, dismissing her in the same glance. "About your judgment." Ruby felt heat rise in her cheeks but forced herself to continue cleaning, making herself invisible while her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd grown up in houses where she wasn't supposed to exist while the real people had important conversations. "My judgment is fine," James said evenly. "Is it?" Marcus opened his briefcase, pulling out a tablet that showed what looked like financial reports. "Morrison Tech's third-quarter projections are down 8%. You've missed 3 board meetings in the past month. The Singapore contract is stalled because you haven't been returning calls from the investors." Each accusation hit like a physical blow. Ruby watched James's shoulders tense, saw him retreat into the cold executive persona she'd thought was finally thawing. "I'm handling the Singapore deal." "You're distracted." Marcus's voice carried the particular cruelty of someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure, and I think we both know why. Ruby's hands stilled on the coffee table she was polishing. The silence stretched between the two men like a tripwire, dangerous and ready to snap. "The boys are talking again," James said quietly. "They're healing." "That's wonderful, truly." Marcus's smile was sharp as glass. "But healing doesn't require you to abandon your responsibilities, which is why I'm here with a solution." He pulled out a glossy brochure, sliding it across the marble countertop. Ruby caught a glimpse of pristine Swiss mountains and smiling children before James snatched it up. "The Winterthur Institute," Marcus explained. "Residential therapeutic program in Switzerland. Best in the world for childhood trauma and selective mutism. They've agreed to take Ollie and Liam immediately." The brochure crumpled in James's grip. "No. James, be reasonable. The boys need professional help." "They're getting professional help, Dr. Carter." "Dr. Carter isn't enough." Marcus gestured toward the hallway where the boys had disappeared. "They need intensive intervention, round-the-clock specialists, a controlled environment free from distractions." Ruby's blood turned to ice water. She was the distraction. This whole conversation was about removing her from the equation. "They're 6 years old," James said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They've just started talking again. You want me to ship them off to a facility in another country. I want you to make the hard choices that leadership requires." Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to the intimate tone of shared conspiracies. "Sarah would want what's best for them, not what's easiest for you." The mention of Sarah hit its target with surgical precision. Ruby watched James flinch like he'd been slapped, saw his carefully constructed composure crack under the weight of guilt and grief. "Don't," he whispered. "She made me promise, James, before she died. She made me promise to look after you and the boys if she couldn't. This is me keeping that promise." Ruby felt sick. Marcus wasn't just playing corporate hardball. He was weaponizing a dying woman's love to get what he wanted. And what he wanted, she realized with crystal clarity, was James back under corporate control, isolated from anything that might make him choose family over business. "What about their progress?" James's voice was breaking. "They're laughing again, playing, they're becoming kids again." Marcus glanced at Ruby with a particular disdain reserved for insects that had wandered into clean spaces. Progress facilitated by what exactly? An unqualified cleaning woman with delusions of therapeutic expertise. The words hit Ruby like a physical blow. She'd known this moment would come, the moment when her presence would be revealed as the disruption it was, when her presumption of belonging would be exposed as wishful thinking. "She's not," James started. "She's not what James, not a trained professional, not equipped to handle complex childhood trauma, not appropriate for a family of your standing." Marcus's voice was surgeon precise, cutting with clinical efficiency. "What happens when the novelty wears off? When her methods stop working? What happens to those boys then?" Ruby set down her cleaning cloth with hands that shook only slightly. She'd heard enough. She was the problem here, the variable that didn't fit into Marcus's neat corporate solution. The smart thing, the right thing, would be to remove herself from the equation. "You're right," she said quietly. Both men turned to stare at her, James with something that looked like betrayal, Marcus with satisfied surprise. "I'm not qualified," Ruby continued, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm not a therapist or a child psychologist or anyone important enough to have opinions about what's best for your family." She looked at James, memorizing his face. "I'm just someone who cleans houses and thought she could make a difference." "Ruby," James stepped toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "The boys are better, that's what matters. They're talking, they're playing, they're remembering how to be kids." Her voice broke slightly on the last word. "But Mr. Webb is right. I can't give them what they really need. Professional help, stability, a future that makes sense." She gathered her cleaning supplies with movements that felt mechanical, disconnected from her heart, which was breaking into approximately 1,000,000 pieces. "I'll finish out the week," she said to no one in particular. "Give you time to find a replacement." "There won't be a replacement," Marcus said smoothly. "The boys will be leaving for Switzerland by Monday. James, you'll have your focus back, the board will be satisfied, and the children will get the help they actually need. Everyone wins." Ruby paused in her packing, waiting for James to argue, to fight, to choose his sons over corporate pressure. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, and she realized with devastating clarity that Marcus had played the game perfectly. He'd used Sarah's memory and James's guilt to checkmate them all. "I should go," she said finally. She was halfway to the elevator when she heard it, small feet running on marble, voices calling her name. "Ruby, Ruby, wait." Ollie and Liam burst into the living room, their faces flushed with panic. They'd been listening, she realized. They'd heard everything. "You can't leave," Liam said, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. "We need you." "We'll be good," Ollie added desperately. "We'll clean better, we'll be quieter, we won't make Daddy choose." Ruby dropped to her knees, pulling both boys into her arms. breathing in their shampoo-clean scent and memorizing the weight of their small bodies against hers. "Listen to me," she whispered fiercely. "You are perfect exactly as you are, perfect and brave and smart and funny, and none of this is your fault." "Then why are you leaving?" Liam's voice was muffled against her shoulder. Ruby looked up at James, who was standing frozen by the kitchen island, his face a mask of anguish. Marcus watched the scene with the cold calculation of a chess master who just achieved checkmate. "Sometimes," Ruby said carefully, "adults have to make hard choices, and sometimes those choices hurt even when they're the right ones." But even as she said it, Ruby wondered if this was the right choice or just the easiest one. If she was protecting this family or abandoning them. If love sometimes meant staying to fight or leaving to let them heal. She kissed both boys on their foreheads, tasting salt from their tears, then stood and walked to the elevator without looking back. Because if she looked back, if she saw James's face or the boys' tears or the crystal chess set that had become the symbol of everything beautiful and broken in their lives, she might not be strong enough to leave. The elevator doors closed on the sound of Liam crying for her to stay, and Ruby realized that some games end not with victory or defeat, but with the terrible recognition that the only way to save the king is to sacrifice yourself. Behind the closing doors, James Morrison stood in his marble palace, surrounded by crystal chess pieces and corporate solutions, watching the woman who'd brought his family back to life disappear from their world as suddenly as she'd entered it. The silence that followed Ruby's departure was different from the grief-soaked quiet James had lived with for 2 years. This silence screamed. Ollie and Liam sat on their beds, backs pressed against the wall, arms wrapped around each other like survivors of a shipwreck. They hadn't spoken a word since Ruby left 3 days ago. Not to him, not to Dr. Carter, not to each other. They'd simply retreated back into the protective shell of silence they'd built after their mother died, leaving James standing on the outside once again. He found himself in the living room at 2 in the morning, staring at the crystal chess set that had become the focal point of their fragile healing. Sarah's queen caught the Seattle streetlight from 40 floors below, casting rainbows across the marble like fractured hope. His phone buzzed, Marcus probably with updates about the Switzerland arrangements. James let it ring. The penthouse felt like a tomb again, all marble surfaces and perfect angles, and the echo of laughter that had lasted exactly 1 week. One perfect, impossible week when his sons had remembered how to be children, and he'd remembered what it felt like to be their father instead of their warden. Ruby had been wrong about one thing. She wasn't just someone who cleaned houses. She was someone who saw the mess underneath the spotless surfaces and wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty fixing it. She'd looked at his broken family and seen potential instead of pathology. She'd treated his traumatized sons like normal kids who needed joy more than therapy. And he'd let her walk away because a man in an expensive suit had made him feel like wanting her to stay was selfish. James picked up his phone, scrolling through the messages he'd been ignoring. Marcus, the Switzerland Institute, board members expressing concern about his recent behavioral changes. Everyone had an opinion about what was best for his family except the people who actually lived in it. The last message was from Dr. Carter. The boys are exhibiting regression, behaviors consistent with secondary abandonment trauma. Recommend immediate intervention before Switzerland placement. Secondary abandonment trauma. As if his son's pain could be reduced to clinical terminology. As if the solution was more professional distance instead of the messy, imperfect love that had actually been working. James set the phone aside and really looked at the chess board for the first time since Ruby had transformed it from a monument to grief into a tool for connection. She'd moved some of the pieces during their last game. The White King was no longer cowering behind his pawns but standing beside his queen, protecting her while she protected the realm. Working together, taking care of each other, that's how you win. His own words, spoken to his sons while Ruby smiled and pretended not to notice how his hands shook as he touched each crystal piece. She taught him something that 2 years of grief counseling hadn't. That healing wasn't about moving on from love but learning to love despite loss. The elevator chimed softly, and James looked up to see Mrs. Patterson stepping into the penthouse, her silver hair disheveled and her usually immaculate appearance wrinkled with worry. "Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but—" "The boys are fine," he said automatically. "No," she said firmly, "they're not, and neither are you." She moved to stand beside him, her gaze taking in the chess set and his wrinkled clothes and the general air of a man who'd forgotten how to take care of himself. "I've been managing households for 30 years, and I've never seen a family heal the way yours was healing. What happened?" James almost smiled at her directness. Mrs. Patterson had worked for him since before the boys were born, weathering Sarah's death and his subsequent transformation from husband and father into something resembling a functional automaton. She'd recommended Ruby in the first place, he remembered. She'd known exactly what his family needed. "Marcus thinks the boys need professional help. Real help, not just love." Mrs. Patterson's voice was sharp with disapproval. "That girl brought life back into this house. Your sons were laughing, Mr. Morrison. When's the last time you heard them laugh before Ruby came?" "I can't remember," James admitted. "And now they won't eat, won't talk. Liam asked me yesterday if it was his fault that Ruby left, and Ollie told him to stop asking questions because questions make people go away." She fixed him with the kind of look that had probably terrified generations of employers into better behavior. "Is that the healing you want for them?" James closed his eyes, seeing his sons' faces when Ruby had knelt to hug them goodbye. The way Ollie had tried to negotiate, promising to be good, to be quiet, to be whatever they needed him to be to make her stay. 6-year-olds shouldn't have to bargain for love. "I don't know how to fix this," he said quietly. "Yes, you do." Mrs. Patterson's voice was gentler now. "You're just scared to try because it means admitting that love is messier and more complicated than corporate strategy. But your boys don't need a CEO, Mr. Morrison. They need their father." She was right, and he knew it. Somewhere between Sarah's death and building his empire, he'd confused providing with protecting, control with care. He'd been so afraid of losing what remained of his family that he'd forgotten how to actually live with them. "Marcus will fight me on this. The board will adapt or find themselves looking for a new CEO." Mrs. Patterson smiled, the expression transforming her usually stern features. "Morrison Tech survived before you became its prisoner, and it'll survive if you remember that some things matter more than quarterly projections." James looked at the chess set again, at the pieces Ruby had moved during their last game together. The white king standing beside his queen instead of hiding behind her, taking risks instead of playing it safe. "I need to see her," he said. "She's working at Sunrise Cleaning Services now, full-time." Mrs. Patterson pulled a business card from her pocket like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Day shift. They'll know where to find her." James took the card, his fingers brushing the simple logo that represented Ruby's compromise with financial reality. She'd taken the safe job, the one that paid better and asked less of her heart, just like he'd chosen corporate approval over family happiness. "Mrs. Patterson." He looked up at the woman who'd been more family than employee for longer than he'd appreciated. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when you've brought her home." James found Ruby cleaning the 15th floor of a downtown office building, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her movements efficient, but without the joy she'd brought to his penthouse. She was wiping down conference room tables that probably saw more honest conversation in a day than his boardroom had in years. She looked up when the elevator chimed, and he watched her face cycle through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope before settling on careful neutrality. "Mr. Morrison." She didn't stop cleaning, If you're looking for a reference, I'm looking for you, he said simply. Ruby's hand stilled on the table's surface. I thought we settled this. I'm not qualified to. You're not qualified to be a therapist, James interrupted, stepping into the conference room. You're not qualified to run a Fortune 500 company or perform brain surgery or pilot a spacecraft. You're also not qualified to walk on water or raise the dead, in case that was going to come up. Despite herself, Ruby's mouth quirked upward. Point taken. But you are qualified to love my sons, to see them as people instead of problems, to believe that healing can look like playing, and that sometimes the best therapy is teaching someone how to dust furniture like they're fighting dragons. Ruby set down her cleaning cloth, really looking at him for the first time. He looked terrible, wrinkled shirt, hair that needed cutting, the kind of exhaustion that came from 3 days of watching your children slip away from you again. The boys haven't spoken since you left. They're back in their room, back in their bubble, back to being ghosts in their own house. His voice broke slightly. And it's my fault. I let Marcus convince me that corporate solutions could fix family problems. I let him make me feel guilty for choosing joy over efficiency. Ruby felt her chest tighten with hope and terror in equal measure. What about Switzerland? Cancelled, along with my next 3 board meetings and the Singapore trip and anything else that isn't directly related to being a father to my sons. And Marcus? James's smile was sharp as broken crystal. Marcus has been reminded that he works for Morrison Tech, not the other way around. And Morrison Tech is a family company, which means family comes first. Ruby stared at him, this man who'd torn apart corporate agreements and canceled international deals to stand in a generic office building and ask her to come back to them. The gesture was so completely opposite to everything she'd believed about his priorities that she felt dizzy. I still don't have the right qualifications, she said weakly. Neither do I. James stepped closer, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he'd used when teaching his son's chess moves. I don't have qualifications to be a single father or to help traumatized children or to know what Sarah would have wanted for them. But I love them, and that has to be enough to start with. And what about me? The question came out smaller than she'd intended. What happens when the novelty wears off, when you remember that I'm just someone who cleans houses for a living? James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands like she was made of the same precious crystal as Sarah's chess pieces. Ruby, he said softly, you don't clean houses for a living. You clean houses to pay for your psychology degree so you can open a center for kids who need someone to see them the way you see Ollie and Liam. You're not just someone who cleans, you're someone who heals. And my family needs healing more than it needs anything else. The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were unkind, but because they were true. She'd been so busy thinking of herself as the help that she'd forgotten she was also the helper, someone with gifts that mattered, with love that made a difference. The boys might not forgive me for leaving, she whispered. They're 6, James said gently. They forgive everything if you show up with the right apology and a willingness to play chess. Ruby laughed despite herself, a sound that echoed off the bland office walls like music. What kind of apology? The kind that involves teaching their father how to make pancakes with faces, James said. Sarah's recipe is in her cookbook, and I have no idea what I'm doing, but I figure that's what makes it an adventure. Ruby looked at this man who'd built an empire but couldn't make breakfast, who'd conquered boardrooms but was terrified of his own children's emotions, who just dismantled corporate relationships to chase down his cleaning lady and ask her to teach him how to be human. Okay, she said. Okay. Okay, I'll come back, but I have conditions. James nodded, the gesture of a man who'd learned that the best negotiations were the ones where everyone won. I want to finish my degree, and I want your support when I open my center, not financial support necessarily, but the kind of support that means Morrison Tech will partner with programs that help kids who have been through trauma. Done. And I want honesty. If the board pressures you again, if Marcus comes back with more corporate solutions, if you start choosing business over family, I want you to tell me before you make decisions that affect all of us. Done. Ruby took a deep breath, hardly believing she was about to upend her safe, steady job for the beautiful chaos of the Morrison family. And James, she used his first name deliberately, claiming the intimacy he'd offered. I want you to know that this isn't about charity or fixing broken things. This is about love. Messy, complicated, imperfect love that doesn't come with guarantees but is worth the risk anyway. James's smile was brighter than all the crystal chess pieces in the world. Ruby Gonzalez, he said, I think that might be the most qualified thing anyone's ever said to me. When they walked out of the office building together, Ruby realized they were heading into the kind of unknown territory that couldn't be mapped or controlled or reduced to corporate strategy. They were heading into the scary, wonderful business of becoming a family. And for the first time in her life, she couldn't wait to get her hands dirty cleaning up that particular mess. Ruby stood outside the Morrison penthouse for the first time in 4 days, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the crystal chess set still positioned in the center of the living room, pieces frozen in their last game like actors waiting for the curtain to rise again. James stood beside her, his hand hovering near the elevator button, equally nervous despite the fact that this was his home and these were his children. What if they won't see me? Ruby asked quietly. Then we wait, James said simply, and we keep showing up until they're ready. The elevator rose silently through 40 floors of Seattle morning light, carrying them toward a reunion that might heal or might shatter what remained of the fragile peace they'd built. When the doors opened, the penthouse greeted them with the particular silence of a house holding its breath. Mrs. Patterson appeared from the kitchen, her face carefully neutral. They're in their room, she said quietly. They know you're here. Ruby nodded, suddenly unsure of her legs. 4 days ago, she'd left this place convinced she was the problem. Now she was back, hoping she might be part of the solution. I'll go first, James said, but Ruby caught his arm. Together, she said firmly, we do this together. They walked down the hallway toward the boys' room, past family photos that showed the progression of the Morrison family from complete to broken to something that might, possibly, become whole in a different way. Ruby could hear whispered voices behind the door, Ollie and Liam having one of their silent conversations that said everything without making a sound. James knocked gently. Boys, Ruby and I would like to talk to you. Silence. Ruby stepped closer to the door, pressing her palm against the smooth wood like she could transfer comfort through her touch. Ollie, Liam, I know you might be angry with me. You have every right to be angry, but I'd like to explain why I left if you'll let me. More whispered consultation than footsteps. The door opened just a crack, revealing one pale blue eye. Liam, Ruby thought, though it was hard to tell when they were being cautious. Are you going to leave again? The voice was small, careful, edged, with the kind of wariness that came from having adults promise things they couldn't deliver. Ruby knelt down so she was eye level with the crack in the door. I hope not, but I can't promise that bad things won't happen, because sometimes they do. What I can promise is that if I ever have to leave, it won't be because you weren't good enough or because you asked too many questions or because loving you was too hard. The door opened wider. Liam appeared fully, his twin brother right behind him like a shadow. Both boys looked pale and thin, their eyes too big for their faces, like they'd spent the last 4 days forgetting how to eat or sleep or believe in good things. We thought it was our fault, Ollie said quietly. We thought we made you go away like we made Mama go away. Ruby's heart cracked open. She reached out slowly, offering her hands like a question instead of a demand. After a moment's hesitation, both boys stepped forward, letting her pull them into the kind of hug that tried to fix everything broken in the world. "Oh, sweet boys," she whispered fiercely. "You didn't make your mama go away. Mama got sick, and sick isn't anyone's fault. And you didn't make me go away either. I left because I was scared that I wasn't good enough for you, scared that loving you would hurt you somehow." "That's stupid," Liam said into her shoulder, his voice muffled but firm. Ruby laughed despite the tears on her cheeks. "You're absolutely right. It was stupid. But sometimes adults do stupid things when they're scared, just like sometimes kids do." James knelt beside them, completing their circle on the hallway floor. "I did stupid things too," he said quietly. "I let someone convince me that sending you away to school was better than keeping our family together. I forgot that the most important thing isn't being perfect, it's being together." Ollie pulled back to look at his father with serious 6-year-old eyes. "Are you going to do more stupid things?" "Probably," James admitted. "But I'm going to try really hard to ask you and Ruby what you think before I make big decisions. And if I do mess up, I'm going to apologize and try to fix it." "Like a do-over?" Liam asked. "Exactly like a do-over," Ruby said. "Speaking of which, would you like to help me and your daddy make do-over pancakes with faces?" The transformation was immediate and magical. Both boys straightened, their pallor giving way to the first real color Ruby had seen in their cheeks since she'd returned. "You know how to make Mama's pancakes?" Ollie asked wonderingly. "I don't," Ruby admitted. "But your daddy found her recipe, and I thought we could figure it out together. It might be messy." "We like messy," Liam declared with the authority of someone who'd recently discovered that perfect wasn't the same as happy. They moved to the kitchen like a small parade of hope, the boys chattering about pancake faces and whether chocolate chips counted as proper eyes. Ruby found Sarah's cookbook marked with a dozen bookmarks and notes written in feminine handwriting that spoke of a woman who'd believed in the importance of Sunday morning rituals. "She made these every week?" Ruby asked, studying the recipe that looked more like a love letter than cooking instructions. "Extra vanilla for sweetness, let the boys help with the mixing. Don't worry if they're not perfect. Imperfect pancakes taste better." "Every Sunday," James said softly. "I haven't touched this cookbook since she died. I was afraid." "Afraid they wouldn't taste right," Ruby guessed. "Afraid they'd taste exactly right, and I'd fall apart." Ruby handed him the mixing bowl, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Maybe falling apart isn't the worst thing that could happen. Maybe it's just making room for something new to grow." What followed was the most beautifully chaotic cooking experience of Ruby's life. The boys insisted on cracking the eggs, which resulted in more shell than yolk making it into the bowl. James measured flour with scientific precision while Liam added just a little more vanilla with the generous hand of someone who believed more was always better. Ollie appointed himself official taste tester and declared each batch of batter almost perfect, but needs more mixing. By the time they had actual pancakes cooking on the griddle, the kitchen looked like a flour bomb had exploded. Ruby had batter in her hair, James had somehow gotten vanilla extract on his expensive sweater, and both boys were covered in enough ingredients to make their own pancakes. "Now for the faces," Ruby announced, pulling out a bag of chocolate chips and some strawberry slices she'd found in the refrigerator. "Mama always made them different," Ollie explained seriously, taking his role as family historian with appropriate gravity. "Happy faces for good days, sleepy faces for lazy days, silly faces for when we needed to laugh." "What kind of day is today?" Ruby asked. The boys considered this with the careful attention that important questions deserved. "A beginning day," Liam said finally. "What does a beginning face look like?" James asked. "Surprised," Ollie declared, "because beginnings are surprising." So they made surprised pancake faces, wide chocolate chip eyes and strawberry slice mouths opened in perfect O's of wonder. Ruby watched James serve them with the careful attention he probably brought to million-dollar negotiations, making sure each pancake was perfect, each face symmetrical and properly surprised. "Daddy," Liam said around a mouthful of pancake, "these taste like Mama's but different." "Different how?" James asked, tension creeping into his voice. "Like Mama's but with more people," Ollie clarified. "Like Mama would make them if she was here with all of us." The words hung in the kitchen air like a benediction. Ruby watched James's face cycle through grief and gratitude, and something that looked like peace. Maybe that was what moving forward looked like, not leaving love behind but making room for it to grow bigger, to include new people and new possibilities. After breakfast, they migrated to the living room where the crystal chess set waited like an old friend. The pieces were exactly where they'd left them during their last game, frozen in mid-strategy. "Want to finish?" Ruby asked. "I don't remember whose turn it was," James admitted. "Mine," Liam said confidently. "I was going to move my horsey." They settled on the marble floor again, Ruby and James flanking the boys like bookends. As Liam carefully moved his knight in an illegal but creative L-shape that somehow managed to threaten 3 pieces at once, Ruby felt the particular contentment that came from being exactly where you belonged. "Ruby," Ollie looked up from contemplating his next move, "are you going to live with us now?" The question was casual, asked with the easy assumption of childhood that love should be simple and proximity should be natural. Ruby glanced at James, reading the hope and terror in his eyes. "Would you like me to?" she asked carefully. "Yes," both boys said in unison, the kind of emphatic agreement that brooked no argument. "I'd like that too," Ruby said slowly. "But there are grown-up things to figure out first, like where I'd sleep and whether your daddy and I are ready for that big a step." "You could sleep in Daddy's room," Liam suggested with 6-year-old practicality. "It's really big, and he has bad dreams sometimes. Maybe you could help with the bad dreams like you help with the sad." James went very still. Ruby could see him processing his son's casual revelation that his nightmares weren't as private as he'd thought, that his children worried about his pain the same way he worried about theirs. "Maybe someday," Ruby said gently, "when everyone's ready." "How will we know when we're ready?" Ollie asked. Ruby looked at James, then at the 2 boys who'd somehow become hers without any official paperwork or legal declarations, just through the simple alchemy of showing up and staying and choosing love over fear. "I think we'll know because it won't feel scary anymore," she said. "It'll just feel right." James reached across the chess board, covering her hand with his. "It already feels right," he said quietly. And looking around the penthouse that no longer felt like a museum, at the flower handprints on the marble countertops, at the boys whose laughter had returned like migrating birds, at the crystal chess pieces that reflected light instead of sorrow, Ruby had to agree. 6 months later, Ruby opened the Sound of Small Victories Children's Center in a renovated warehouse in South Seattle, funded by a partnership between Morrison Tech and the University of Washington's Psychology Department. The center specialized in play therapy for children who'd experienced trauma, with a particular focus on activities that looked like games but felt like healing. The grand opening was a small affair. Ruby's family, Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Carter, and a dozen kids who were learning that broken things could be beautiful, and that sometimes the best therapy involved teaching dragons how to dust furniture. James stood in the corner, watching Ruby demonstrate proper chess etiquette to a group of 8-year-olds who were more interested in making the horses jump over castles than following actual rules. Ollie and Liam flanked her like assistant instructors, their authority as experts in creative chess playing undisputed. "She's good at this," Dr. Carter observed, joining James by the refreshment table. "She's good at seeing people," James corrected. "The therapy part is just what she does with what she sees." Dr. Carter smiled, making a note on the ever-present clipboard that had become her trademark. The boys are thriving. No signs of regression, healthy attachment patterns, age-appropriate social development. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. James watched his sons explain to a shy girl that queens were the most powerful pieces because they took care of everyone else on the board, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who'd finally learned the difference between controlling his family and protecting it. Mr. Morrison, one of Ruby's students, a boy about Ollie's age with serious eyes and careful movements, appeared at his elbow. "Ms. Ruby says you're really good at chess. Want to play?" James looked around the bustling center, at children playing games that doubled as therapy, at Ruby demonstrating that healing could look like joy. This wasn't the life he'd planned when he'd hired a cleaning lady 6 months ago, but it was better than anything he could have strategized. "I'd love to," he said, settling on the floor beside a wooden chess set that looked nothing like his crystal pieces at home. "But I should warn you, I'm learning that the best way to win isn't always the way you expect." The boy nodded solemnly, already moving his first pawn. "Ms. Ruby says the best games are the ones where everybody gets to play again." James smiled, moving his own pawn forward to meet the challenge. "Ms. Ruby is very smart." Through the window of the center, Seattle's winter light was giving way to the first hints of spring. In a few hours, he'd drive home to the penthouse where Ruby now kept a toothbrush by his sink and her psychology textbooks on his coffee table. They'd have dinner with the boys, maybe play a game of chess where all the rules were suggestions, and laughter was the only way to keep score. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd chosen, messy and imperfect, and filled with the kind of small victories that added up to something magnificent. As he contemplated his next move on the wooden board, James Morrison realized he'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the only way to win the game is to change the rules. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, someone comes along who's brave enough to change them with you.